This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed. After what's felt like months, even years of build-up when we come to this election, we're days away from the 5th of November when Americans will head to the polls to vote in the presidential election. So in this episode of our Shortcut series on the US election, we're looking at the people and issues to keep an eye on in the final days of campaigning and what experts are saying about the predicted outcome. Squiz Shortcuts is the backstory to the big news stories. I'm Kate Watson.
And I'm Claire Kimball.
Claire, as they say, it's crunch time. The polls are saying it's going to be very close between Democratic candidate Kamala Harris and Republican Donald Trump. So close, even the most expert of the experts, and we are putting them in,
air quotes.
It depends on your opinion of who's an expert and who's not, but there are lots of people willing to make a prediction, and there's lots of people that are not willing to make a prediction because of how tight it is. The polls have sort of had them level pegging for a couple of weeks now. Things aren't really moving. How excited are you?
Oh, I'm very excited. It's going to be
about
incredible. About the closeness, about the key races, about how this campaign is playing out.
Don't expect you to do a lot of work between sort of what? When will it be? Because so we're saying Tuesday the 5th of November, but for people who really want to watch this, we are talking early Wednesday morning and through Wednesday where we're going to start seeing results come in.
Yeah, pace yourself. I reckon get a fair bit of sleep over the weekend. Monday, have an early night. Tuesday, you're going to push through into the evening.
Okay.
You're going to get up early on Wednesday and see what's happened and then push through Wednesday with the result. For us here in Australia, it's going to be right down to the wire by the looks of things.
That is when we'll record our final episode and it will be out next Thursday. So we're not quite done, but this is our second last episode. Let's kick off by focusing on where the candidates are putting their attention and on what issues. So there's no surprise that it's the swing states that are getting a lot of FaceTime with Trump and Harris.
No surprise about that. Of course, this is one of those occasions where in podcast land it's not very helpful. A map would be really handy now to give you the visual. We'll put a tracker into the episode notes though because you can really see visually where they're spending their time. Not a lot of surprise when it comes to Harris and Trump. It's Michigan and Pennsylvania. Then it's Wisconsin, Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, and Nevada.
They're the 7 swing states. So they're the 7 states that will potentially decide this election. And then they'll go to a handful of other states, New York, Texas, California. Definitely not swing states, but there's a reason they'll go there.
Yeah, a couple of reasons. So that's where some of the really big fundraising activities happen. You can imagine those beautiful cocktail parties in Hollywood, for example. In Texas, there's a lot of oil money, so there are things happening there. The other thing to know about those places is they're the sort of events that they're holding that can make great content. So think about Beyonce, for example, doing a Harris campaign rally, big pictures from there.
As we record this podcast, I think Trump's doing something in New York and there's all sorts of celebrities appearing and it's a whole thing. The pictures, it's all about the pictures at this point. How can we get the right pictures in front of the right people to convince them to vote for us? As for what they're doing and saying on the campaign trail, Donald Trump at Macca's, speaking of pictures, that was a bit of a moment.
It really was a bit of a moment. I just love this. So it was at a place called Feasterville.
Was it really? I missed that.
In Pennsylvania. The McDonald's restaurant was closed, but some customers were handpicked by the franchisee. It was just one of those interesting sort of collation of people coming through the drive-through where they were served by Trump. Essentially, it was an event designed to troll Harris, and that's because Harris has talked about her working class roots, that when she was a kid she worked at McDonald's, when she was a lot younger.
Just explain that a little bit. Like, trolling Harris is a big phrase, I guess.
It is a big phrase. So Trump has accused Harris of lying about her working class roots,
right?
About not being the sort of person that she's saying that she is. So the battle for America's working class vote is a really big focus of this election. Both candidates have something that they want to say to those people, and those people are quite large and overrepresented in the undecided voting category. When it comes to Trump and what he's focusing on, it segues quite nicely. So he's really focusing on the economy under Biden. Cost of living pressures, of course, has been a really big thing, and immigration. So it all comes back to jobs. It all comes back to, as Trump would say, these illegal immigrants taking our jobs, making our communities more unsafe. So Trump's language as we get through this has got more and more coarse as we go on. And what the pundits are saying is that it's all about targeting white men, particularly white men who don't have college degrees.
So what you're saying is Harris is focusing on her experience being that she is from a working class family and has a working class background. Trump can't claim that for himself, but he's trying to speak to those people in the way that he's presenting himself. I guess a good thing to do at this point is to give an example of what we're talking about. While talking about Chinese President Xi Jinping, Donald Trump said he respects me and he knows I'm effing crazy.
Effing crazy.
And you don't hear Trump swear a lot, so this seems quite deliberate. On Harris, he said she was a word starting with S and ending in T, vice president.
An ST vice president, yeah. And Trump, as you say, is a lot of things, but he's not known for his potty mouth, particularly in those public forums. So he's absolutely doing that for a reason. When it comes to talking down Harris, he's really sheeting home that cost of living conversation. Biden's administration, of course, it was under Joe Biden. She's the vice president, so she's tied to all of that. And he's laying blame for what he calls the disaster on the border at Harris's door as well.
We've covered those issues in the last 2 episodes of this series, so go back and have a listen if you're interested particularly in the issues of the campaign. We talked specifically in episode 2 about domestic issues and then in episode 3 about international issues. Those episodes are all in this feed, so just scroll backwards and you'll find them all. As for Harris, she is really zeroing in on abortion.
This isn't a sideline issue either. It's a really big issue in this election campaign. So Harris has said that her first priority as president would be to put back in place the protections that were gone when Roe versus Wade was overturned. And she says, stop this pain stemming from state abortion bans. So what she's done repeatedly in the campaign is to highlight the stories of women across the country who have had some very bad outcome because the states have restricted access to abortion. At the same time, she's really highlighting the inconsistencies in Trump's stance. He's boasted about appointing the judges that helped overturn Roe versus Wade, and he has said that the limits and the restrictions brought in by some states are too short, but he's also said that he wouldn't introduce any sort of national abortion ban.
Yeah, so he's kind of hedging his bets on this one is certainly what the experts are saying. Harris is saying to voters, do you really trust this guy on this issue, I guess, in that vein?
Yeah, when it comes to a national ban, do you trust him? Do you take him at his word that he won't move to actually further restrict abortion rights?
There's also, I guess what we were talking about is a surprising new campaigning technique that's popped up in this campaign on this specific issue.
There's been these sort of loose-knit groups of women that have formed.
Oh, I've never heard someone say loose-knit.
Loose-knit?
Oh, like as opposed to tight-knit.
Tight-knit, loose-knit.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, there you go. It's a bit looser than
they're
the
all
tight.
connected, but they're like
connected,
not that
but a little bit more
yeah,
loosely.
Got it?
Yeah, exactly. And what they've done is they've organised online to go into their communities and put pro-Kamala Harris messages on sticky notes in the toilets.
Right.
Essentially what those sticky notes say, you write messages on them and post them to women who might see them, saying things like, if you feel like this is an issue for you, maybe vote for Kamala Harris. Even if you think that might be a problem for you, just keep it secret. Don't tell your friends, don't tell your family. Vote for Harris. And
we're talking specifically about abortion, the idea being that no one has to know, you can do it and we're all here supporting you. That's designed to appeal to women who would usually support the Republican candidate. So they might be expected to vote for Donald Trump. They might be expected to vote for the Republicans, but they just can't get their heads around supporting Donald Trump.
Yeah, and these are particularly in places that are very Republican towns and cities and suburbs. So, yeah, it's been a really surprising thing to pop up. Segues nicely, I guess, into the other point about Harris's campaign is that she's really working very hard to be seen as what they call as what the experts call a generic Democrat.
We're not making fun. There are experts. It's just, it's just funny. What that means is we're not seeing much from her about being a woman and a woman of colour. I found this a really interesting observation that she's not really wanting to talk about her identity too much. She just wants to be a person for the general population. You're not seeing a lot of vote for me because it's time we had a woman in the White House, for example, even though she would be the first female president.
Exactly right. So she's not making a virtue of any of that. Comes down to that simple assessment by experts that's really been around since the start of this year when the campaign started to heat up. Of course, she wasn't the candidate until later in the year, but the assessment was when you looked at the polls that a generic Democrat, so someone who's sort of straight up and down, just into a fair go for workers and a strong sort of social safety net, that they would be able to beat Donald Trump.
That assessment still stands today. Let's get into some more about the predictions. What might happen next? In the last weeks of the campaign, both candidates have been concentrating on finding and converting undecided voters in those swing states that we talked about. That takes a lot of money, a lot of money. We have talked about money, I think, in our first episode.
And exactly how much those, particularly TV ads, we're going to take those budgets. So let's look at the period from July to September, which is the latest reporting period when it comes to those disclosures. When it comes to campaign ads, reports say that Harris has spent US $826 million just in those 3 months on TV ads. For Donald Trump, it's $340 million.
It is a staggering amount of money. It's not surprising. Residents in those swing states have reported election exhaustion. Can you imagine how much advertising will be coming at them?
Yeah, in those 7 states. Certainly listening to podcasts and Ben Smith, your conversation with him saying he was in a particular area that was being really targeted and it was just ad after ad.
He actually said he was in New York.
Yeah.
Like he was even in New York,
it's happening.
Here we go again.
Yeah. And it's impossible for Americans to avoid that because they're big into sport, or a lot of Americans big into sport, and that's the ads. So, it's really, really happening. As for where they're getting their campaign cash from, Elon Musk has put up $118 million for the Trump campaign. It's made him Trump's second biggest backer. Billionaire Timothy Mellon is the biggest backer of Donald Trump, $150 million that he's given to the campaign so far. His donations are to an independent super PAC, not to the Trump campaign itself, though.
And you say PAC like everyone should know what on earth you mean. It's not PAC, P-A-C-K, the word. It's P-A-C in capitals. It's a political action committee. They're referred to quite a bit in the coverage. A super PAC is a big political action committee. Under America's political fundraising laws, they can raise unlimited sums of money from corporations, unions, associations, individuals, then spend unlimited sums to overtly advocate for or against political candidates.
Yeah, and the reason that they have these is that the candidates can't do that themselves.
Right.
Spend unlimited amounts of money. So it's a bit of a quirk of the US system. And just to give you
So Donald Trump can't spend unlimited amounts of his own money.
But someone else can.
Yeah.
So away they go. And just to give you a sense of the scale of all of this, at the start of this week, 2,455 groups are organised as super PACs, and they've raised $4.3 billion to support Harris or Trump.
That's big business. Who is running these PACs?
It's a whole business in and of itself.
Yeah, amazing. As for Harris, and just important to note, she's actually out fundraised Donald Trump by 3-1, but she has a lot smaller donors. So he gets those big bucks from certain people, whereas she's getting less money, but from a lot of people. The biggest super PAC supporting her is called Future Forward USA. It's led by a bloke called Dustin Moskovitz.
Yeah, so he's someone to clock because it's the biggest in her camp. He's the biggest donor also of a charitable movement known as effective altruism.
Yeah, we talked about this before.
Yeah, the Sam Altman case. Remember, he was one of these effective altruistic people. It's a very sort of Silicon Valley kind of thing, the idea that you can make a lot of money and then spend it on good things.
Yeah, so it's like capitalism for good.
Yeah, exactly.
Something like that.
Yeah. And of course, Sam Altman was the crypto king who's now in jail.
Yeah, don't worry about Sam Altman.
Just to put the full stop there. So Muscovitz is one of the founders of Facebook. Back in the Harvard days, he was at uni with Mark Zuckerberg. He hasn't stumped up himself in this future forward cash, not a big lot of money anyway. It's Bill Gates who has.
Which is interesting because Bill Gates has spent his lifetime really staying out of politics, and this time around he's made a $50 million donation to that super PAC. A donation he would have preferred was kept private though, Claire.
That's a bit of the idea around these super PACs.
Like you don't really know.
You don't really know sort of where that money's from until it's all disclosed after the event, but it made its way into the media. It got its share of headlines last week.
There's so much more to read about who's donating to who and why and who's backing who and why. And, you know, Elon Musk even was a big surprise. We didn't know he was a Trump supporter until the election came around. And
hasn't he come home for Donald Trump?
Exactly. Yeah. So it is fascinating to look at where that money is falling. But let's leave that there. Let's talk about early voting.
Yep.
How does that work in the US?
Well, 2020 is a really interesting case to sort of benchmark, I guess. Only a quarter of voters turned up and voted on election day. 75% of those 160 million votes that they counted came before election day. Just to remind you what happened in 2020, there was a pandemic.
Oh, yeah. So that was part of that?
Well, the idea...
So do we think it'll be different this time? Or we think it'll be the same?
Yeah, so 2020, the idea was people weren't really all that keen to be in one place at one time. And there was actually quite a few states who were saying just vote early whenever you can. You might also remember this sort of narrative from Trump that early voting was part of the fraud that happened, that there were sort of rigged election results against him that came through these early voting. So over the last 4 years, some states, Republican states, have actually passed state laws that will make it harder for voters to cast their ballot in advance of election day.
So it's harder to make that accusation, I guess. Regardless of any of that, both Republicans and Democrats are just encouraging people to vote, however which way they want to do it, early or on the day. So far, about 20% of voters have already cast their ballots. The experts are, loath to make any judgment about what that means and if there's a side that's favouring.
Yeah, the scale of it will be quite different by the looks of things, although who knows what will happen in that last week.
It's so interesting just recording this now after we've just had a Queensland election where those pre-poll votes were remarkably important when it came to the LNP being elected.
Yeah, and probably quite similar to what happened in Queensland. The people who were voting early there, by and large, had made up their mind well and truly in advance of election day. But there are questions this time around about whether that's the case again or whether they just like to avail themselves of the facility to do it early. The experts aren't really making a call on that.
So if we are going to tune in, we are going to not, rest up on the weekend and then on Tuesday we're going to start tuning in and then we're going to get up early on Wednesday.
Yeah.
But anyone
just stay up for 48 hours.
Yeah, but anyone joining you in that endeavour, not me. The states to watch, I guess, really are Pennsylvania and Michigan.
If there's one thing you take out of this.
Michigan and Pennsylvania.
Michigan and Pennsylvania. Okay. So, yeah, just keep a mind on them. Michigan, probably one little fun fact to take home from that. It's home to America's largest Arab population. There's anger there about the way the Biden administration has supported Israel as tensions continue to simmer in the Middle East. Last week, some really key Muslim leaders in Michigan endorsed Donald Trump. So whether that has an influence on voters, let's wait and see. The other thing about that is they might be so angry that they don't vote at all. So it's something to watch.
Pennsylvania.
So it's got 19 electoral college votes. If you need a bit of a refresher about the electoral college, it's a lot.
Okay.
Yeah. So you might want to go back to our first episode that unpacks all of that. It's tipped to be the most consequential battleground of this election. Biden won Pennsylvania in 2020 by a margin of a little bit more than 1%. Trump won it in 2016 by a little bit less than 1%.
It's so close.
It's a knife edge.
Yeah, really, really close. You've listened to a lot of podcasts about what's happening in Pennsylvania. Do you have a recommendation?
Oh, I feel like I've moved to Pennsylvania. Just like I'm there. I'm in Bucks County. I've got all sorts of ideas about what the people are like
Claire's
there.
not going to remember which one she wants to recommend, but there will be one in your episode notes.
Yeah, there will. It's the Daily from last week.
Yeah,
There's a really deep
to that
dive.
too.
And interesting about, it's kind of like conversations we're having about here in Australia are people moving out of big cities and into regional areas and changing the flavour of some of these towns. When it comes to America and politics and regional Pennsylvania, these are sort of Democrat supporting people moving into those communities that have been very strongly Republican. So it's
let's see.
really interesting. Yeah.
Speaking of recommendations, let's give you some other ones. Gender is always a thing when it comes to US elections. 2 articles to read about women who are the campaign directors for both Harris and Trump. So they both have women at the top of those jobs. The first is from Politico about Trump's campaign director. It's titled How Susie Wiles Became the Most Feared and Least Known Political Operative in America. The second's about the Democrats' Julie Chavez Rodriguez from the LA Times.
Really interesting women.
Yeah.
And like 2 women that I think unless you went digging for it, you would see nothing about. They're running those campaigns. So, yeah, they're 2 women absolutely to know. Just on the issue of gender, Katty Kay is one of the
Best
hosts.
name.
Yeah, I know. It's
Just
awesome.
sticks, doesn't it?
Yeah, she's one of the hosts of The Rest is Politics US, and I've really enjoyed that podcast over the last few weeks and months. She's penned a really great piece. Her day job is actually as the special correspondent for the BBC on American politics, and she's got a really interesting piece in the BBC about the gender divide of this election. She thinks that it's going to be one of the major themes that comes out, how many men show up for Trump and how many women show up for Harris.
I feel like we actually talked about this last week or in Weekly Wrap, and then it got edited out.
Oh.
Because the Daily also had the episode about young men voting for Trump and young women increasingly voting for the Democrats, and how that divide is just becoming more and more and more stark.
Because America's so big, you can cut their demographics many ways, race, gender, age, all sorts of things. But gender seems to be the big one in this election. Let's see.
I'll put links to all of those in your episode notes, as we said. And as I said at the top, next week it's all about the results. We may not have a result, but we'll certainly, regardless, wrap up where things are at next Thursday. So at least you know sort of the general vibe of what went on. If you enjoyed this series, as we always say, please share it with someone else who might enjoy it. We'll be surfacing all of these episodes in the Squiz Today feed across the weekend, so you can listen to them all at once if you really want to.
Oh, what a great way to spend your weekend.
What a great way to spend your weekend, start of your preparation. Thanks for listening, and as I said, we'll be back next Thursday.